There are moments in life that seem completely ordinary until you look back and realize they were the beginning of everything falling apart. Sometimes the warning signs are so small that you brush them aside, convincing yourself they mean nothing. Other times, the truth crashes into your life without warning, leaving you wondering how you could have missed what had been happening right in front of you. Looking back now, I wish I had ignored what I heard that night. I wish I had put my headphones on, turned up the volume, and gone to sleep. Maybe then I would have remembered my family the way it used to be instead of carrying the memory that still follows me everywhere. My name is Elowen Vaughan, and until a few months ago, I believed my parents had the kind of marriage everyone hoped for. They had been together for more than 2 decades. They laughed together, celebrated birthdays together, and somehow managed to survive every challenge life threw at them. My father, Beckett Vaughan, worked long hours as a structural engineer, while my mother, Maren Vaughan, worked from home as an interior designer. Their schedules were different, but they always found time for each other. At least, that's what my younger brother, Stellan, and I believed. That Thursday night felt no different from any other. It was just after midnight, and I was lying in bed absent-mindedly scrolling through my phone because sleep refused to come. The house was silent except for the occasional hum of the air conditioner and the distant sound of rain tapping against the windows. Dad wasn't home. He had flown to Denver that afternoon for a 3-day business conference, leaving Mom, Stellan and me alone in the house. It wasn't unusual. His job required travel every few months, and we had all grown used to it. I was about to put my phone down when I heard something that made me pause. At first, it was nothing more than a soft laugh coming from the other side of the hallway. I assumed Mom was watching television in her bedroom. She often stayed awake later than the rest of us, binge-watching old movies or decorating videos online. I smiled to myself and tried to ignore it, but then another laugh followed. This time it wasn't hers. It was a man's voice. I frowned and sat up in bed. My father wasn't supposed to be home until Saturday afternoon, so hearing another man inside the house instantly made my stomach tighten. I told myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe the television was louder than I thought. Maybe she was talking to one of her clients on a late-night video call. I wanted to believe either of those explanations, but something deep inside me whispered that neither was true. Curiosity slowly pushed aside common sense. I slipped out of bed as quietly as I could and eased my bedroom door open. The hallway was dark except for the faint glow spilling from beneath my mother's bedroom door. I stood there listening. The voices were low, almost impossible to understand, followed by another soft laugh and the unmistakable sound of someone moving across the room. My heart began pounding so hard that I could hear it in my ears. Before I could decide whether to walk closer or return to my room, another bedroom door opened behind me. I turned and found Stellan standing in the hallway, his eyes locked on mine. Neither of us spoke a single word. We didn't have to. The confusion on his face matched the fear growing inside me, and in that silent moment, we both realized we had heard the exact same thing. Neither of us said a word. Stellan slowly walked over until he was standing beside me, both of us staring at the thin strip of light beneath our mother's bedroom door. The voices had become quieter, but they hadn't disappeared. Every now and then we caught the sound of a laugh or a sentence that was too muffled to understand. My heart kept telling me to knock on the door and demand an explanation, but my mind begged me to walk away before I discovered something I could never forget. We stood there for nearly a minute before Stellan gently tugged on my sleeve and motioned toward my room. I nodded and we slipped inside, closing the door as softly as possible. As soon as the door clicked shut, Stellan looked at me with wide, frightened eyes. "Did you hear that too?" he whispered. I nodded slowly. "Yeah." "Who is that?" I wished I had an answer. "I don't know." He sank onto the edge of my bed, rubbing both hands over his face. "Dad's in Denver." "I know. So, why is there another man in Mum's room?" The question hung between us like a heavy cloud. I couldn't answer because saying the possibilities out loud would make them real. We spent the next hour trying to convince ourselves that there had to be another explanation. Maybe one of the Mum's relatives had stopped by because of an emergency. Maybe one of the neighbours needed help with something. Maybe we had misunderstood what we heard. We clung to every excuse we could think of because the truth felt too painful to accept. Eventually the house grew silent again. Around 2 a.m, we heard the faint sound of the front door opening and closing. Someone had just left. Stellan looked at me and I looked back at him. Neither of us moved toward the window. Neither of us wanted to see who had walked out of our house in the middle of the night. The next morning everything felt strangely normal. The smell of pancakes drifted through the hallway. Soft music played from the kitchen speaker, and Mom greeted us with the same warm smile she always wore. If I hadn't been awake the night before, I would have believed nothing unusual had happened. She asked how we slept, poured orange juice into our glasses, and joked that Dad would probably call before lunch to complain about the hotel coffee. Her voice sounded relaxed, but every now and then I noticed her glancing toward her phone on the counter as though she was expecting an important message. When Dad called later that morning, Mum answered almost immediately. She laughed at something he said and told him she missed him already. Hearing those words made my stomach twist. I watched her walk onto the back porch so she could finish the conversation in private. Through the glass door I could see her smiling, nodding, and blowing him a kiss before ending the call. Less than 5 minutes later, her phone buzzed again. She read the new message, and the smile on her face changed. It wasn't the warm smile she had given Dad. It was softer, almost secretive, as though the message belonged to someone she didn't want anyone else thinking about. From that day forward, I started noticing things I had ignored before. Mom guarded her phone like it contained state secrets. She never left it unattended anymore, and whenever a notification appeared, she quickly turned the screen away from us. She also began making unexpected trips out of the house. Sometimes she said she needed groceries, but returned with only one shopping bag after being gone for nearly 3 hours. Other times she claimed she had to meet a client even though it was a weekend. None of those things had seemed unusual before, but now every excuse sounded rehearsed. I tried convincing myself I was overthinking everything, yet the uneasy feeling refused to leave. It wasn't just because of what I had heard that night. It was the way Mom seemed distracted whenever Dad called, the way she smiled at her phone when she thought nobody was looking, and the way she became defensive whenever Stellan casually asked where she had been. Little by little, the image I had always carried of my mother began to crack, and I hated myself for questioning someone I had trusted my entire life. One evening, while we were cleaning up after dinner, Stellan quietly pulled me aside. He lowered his voice so Mom couldn't hear us from the living room. "I don't think we're imagining this anymore," he said. I swallowed hard. "Neither do I." He looked toward the hallway to make sure we were alone before speaking again. "I think we need to find out the truth." The words sent a chill through me because deep down I knew the truth, whatever it was, had the power to destroy everything we had ever called home. The idea stayed with us long after that conversation ended. Neither of us wanted to admit it, but we both knew there was no turning back. Once suspicion takes root, it changes the way you see everything. Every smile starts to look forced. Every excuse begins to sound rehearsed. Every little detail suddenly feels important. I hated that feeling because it meant I was questioning my own mother, but pretending nothing was wrong felt even worse. Over the next several days, Stellan and I became quiet observers inside our own home. We didn't search through Mom's belongings or follow her around town. Instead, we simply paid attention. It was amazing how much you could notice when you stopped taking things for granted. Mom had developed little habits that had never stood out before. She smiled whenever a certain notification appeared on her phone, but only when she thought no one was watching. She stepped outside to answer calls that used to happen right in front of us. She had even started dressing differently on days when she claimed she was meeting clients, taking extra time with her makeup and wearing perfume that Dad had never bought for her. One Friday afternoon, I came home from class earlier than expected. The house was empty except for Mom, who was sitting on the back patio with her laptop open. As soon as she heard the front door, she quickly closed the screen and slipped her phone into her pocket. She greeted me with a cheerful smile, but I noticed the nervous movement of her hands. It lasted only a second before she acted as though nothing had happened.
"You're home early," she said. "My last lecture was canceled," I replied, studying her expression. She nodded a little too quickly. "That's nice. I was just finishing some work." I glanced at the closed laptop on the patio table. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a man's name near the top of the screen before she shut it, but I couldn't be certain. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. Suspicion could make ordinary things seem suspicious. That evening, Dad called during dinner. He sounded tired but happy, talking about the conference and joking that he couldn't wait to get home for one of Mom's homemade meals. She laughed at all the right moments, asked about his meetings, and told him everyone missed him. Watching the conversation felt surreal. If I hadn't known about the strange voice I'd heard days earlier, I would have believed every word she said. After the call ended, Mom carried the dishes into the kitchen. Her phone vibrated almost immediately. She looked at the screen, and for the smallest fraction of a second, the warmth disappeared from her face. Instead, there was anticipation. She quickly typed a short reply before locking the phone and placing it upside down on the counter. Stellan noticed it too. He waited until Mom went upstairs before leaning closer to me. "Did you see that?" I nodded. "Whoever keeps texting her knows when Dad isn't around." His words sent a chill through me. I hadn't thought about it that way before, but he was right. The messages always seemed to arrive after Dad's calls ended or when he was too busy to notice. That couldn't be a coincidence. Saturday afternoon brought another surprise. Mom announced she needed to meet a client to discuss a home renovation project. She grabbed her purse, kissed us on the forehead, and promised she'd be back before dinner. The moment her car disappeared down the street, Stellan looked at me. "I don't think she's meeting a client." I stared through the living room window, watching the empty road. "What are you thinking?" He hesitated before answering. "I think we should find out where she really goes." I knew following our own mother crossed a line neither of us had ever imagined crossing. It felt wrong, almost like we were betraying her trust. But another thought refused to leave my mind. If she was hiding something that could destroy our family, didn't we deserve to know the truth before it destroyed us anyway? I looked at Stellan, hoping he would change his mind. Instead, he quietly picked up the car keys from the hallway table. For the first time in my life, I found myself wondering whether the truth was something we actually wanted to discover. I hesitated for several seconds before taking the keys from Stellan's hand and placing them back on the hallway table. "We're not following her," I whispered. "If she catches us, she'll know we're suspicious." He looked frustrated, but after a long silence, he nodded. Deep down, we both knew I was right. If we were going to uncover the truth, we had to be patient. The rest of the afternoon dragged by. Mom didn't return until nearly 7 o'clock. She walked through the front door carrying 2 small shopping bags and smiling as if she'd simply spent the day running errands. She apologized for being late, saying traffic had been terrible because of an accident on the interstate. Dad called a few minutes later to let us know he had landed safely and would be home the following evening. Mom sounded relieved when she heard his voice, and for a brief moment I wondered if I had imagined everything. Maybe we were wrong. Maybe all of this had a perfectly innocent explanation. That hope disappeared 2 days later. It was Monday evening, and Dad was finally home. The house felt complete again. He brought souvenirs from his trip, handed Stellan a baseball cap from Denver, and surprised me with a hoodie from the university bookstore near his hotel. Mom hugged him tightly when he walked through the front door, and if someone had taken a picture of us that evening, we would have looked like the perfect family. Later that night, while Dad unpacked upstairs, I walked into the kitchen for a glass of water. Mom had left her phone charging on the counter while she folded laundry in the family room. The screen lit up for just a second. Unknown number. I already miss you. Same place Thursday? The message vanished before I could read anything else. My heart started pounding. I hadn't touched the phone. I didn't need to. What I had already seen was enough to erase every remaining doubt. I quietly walked back to my room, closed the door, and sat on the edge of my bed. My hands were trembling so badly that I almost dropped my own phone. A few minutes later, there was a soft knock. Stellan stepped inside. You saw something, didn't you? I looked at him and slowly nodded. There was a message. What did it say? I repeated every word exactly as I remembered it. His face lost all color. So, it's real. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. The silence felt heavier than any conversation we could have had. We weren't just dealing with a suspicion anymore. We were carrying a secret that could shatter our father's life. What do we do? Stellan finally asked. I don't know. We can't keep pretending. I know. But if we tell Dad and we're missing part of the story, I finished his sentence. We could destroy our family for nothing. That was the impossible choice we found ourselves trapped in. Every option seemed wrong. Saying nothing felt like betraying Dad. Saying something without undeniable proof could ruin everything if we had misunderstood the situation. Over the next week, the distance between our parents became easier to notice. Dad tried to reconnect after his trip, suggesting they go out for dinner or spend the weekend at the lake like they used to. Mom always had an excuse. She claimed she was overwhelmed with work, too tired to go anywhere, or already committed to meeting clients. Dad accepted every explanation without complaint, but I could see the disappointment in his eyes each time she turned him down. One Wednesday evening, I found him sitting alone on the back porch after dinner, staring into the darkness with a cup of coffee in his hands. He didn't notice me until I sat beside him. You've been quiet lately, he said with a gentle smile. Everything okay? I forced a smile of my own. Just a lot on my mind. He nodded slowly, looking out across the backyard. You know, he said after a long pause, life has a strange way of testing people. Sometimes the hardest part isn't facing the truth. It's realizing the people you trust most can keep things from you without you ever noticing. His words caught me completely off guard. For a moment, I wondered if he already knew more than he was letting on. The answer came sooner than I expected, but not in the way Stellan or I had imagined. We spent days arguing over whether we should tell Dad the truth, never realizing he had already started putting the pieces together himself. Looking back, I think he had been noticing the changes long before we did. The late-night phone calls, the endless excuses, the emotional distance, none of it had escaped him. He simply chose not to accuse Mom without knowing for certain. A week later, Dad asked me to meet him for lunch. The moment I sat across from him, I could tell something was different. He looked exhausted, but there was also a calmness in his eyes that I hadn't seen since before his business trip. I need you to answer one question honestly, he said quietly. Have you and Stellan been worried about your mother? I looked down at my hands. My silence answered for me. Dad let out a slow breath and nodded. I thought so. I stared at him, confused. I hired a private investigator 3 weeks ago, he continued. I hoped I was wrong. I prayed I was wrong. My heart stopped. He followed your mother for several days. Yesterday, he gave me everything. Dad reached into a folder beside him and gently slid a small envelope across the table. I didn't open it. I didn't have to. The expression on his face told me every photograph inside carried a truth none of us wanted to see. There wasn't just one meeting, he said, his voice almost breaking. There were dozens. Neither of us spoke for a long time. I don't blame either of you, he finally said. You're my children. None of this should have been your burden. That evening, Dad came home earlier than usual. He asked Mom if they could talk privately in the living room. Stellan and I stayed upstairs, but the house was so quiet that we could hear every word. I know, Dad said. There was a long silence. I don't know what you're talking about, Mom replied, though her voice was already shaking. I know about Dashiell. Another silence, longer this time. When Mom finally spoke again, she was crying. I'm so sorry. Dad didn't raise his voice. He didn't throw anything or demand explanations. Somehow, his calmness hurt even more than anger ever could have. I gave you 22 years of my life, he said softly. I trusted you with every dream I had. If you were unhappy, all you had to do was tell me. We could have fought for our marriage together. I was scared, she whispered. You weren't scared when you lied. She tried to reach for his hand, but he stepped back. I still love the woman I married, he said, tears filling his eyes. But she's gone. Mom broke down completely. Please don't leave. We can fix this. Dad slowly shook his head. I still love the woman I married, he said, tears filling his eyes. But she's gone. Mom broke down completely. Please don't leave. We can fix this. Dad slowly shook his head. You didn't lose me the day I found out, he said. You lost me the day you chose someone else. Those words filled the room with a silence so heavy it felt impossible to breathe. A month later, the divorce papers were signed. Stellan moved into Dad's new apartment almost immediately. I divided my time between both parents, but nothing ever felt the same again.